Next, I'd like to share with you the different ways that you can provision a Polycom phone. We'll talk about the few different options that you have, a couple of those being easier and then some of those being a little more challenging, but we'll progressively work up to those and show you how to do that throughout this course. I also want to look at some sample configuration files in the XML format so you can see what some of the settings look like. And then the last thing we'll do is cover how provisioning is done using automated methods. So the configuration methods that are available to you with the Polycom phone is, first and foremost, you can configure a phone through the phone's menu structure, through the phone interface. So you can just walk up to a phone, start using the menu and type in SIP credentials as well as other settings, which we'll go through in future slides. Then we also have the way of doing it through a web-based user interface, which makes it a lot easier to type things in or copy and paste. Then we have a mix of using the user interface and then the XML files. And the XML files are where you get a lot of the settings that aren't available through the user interfaces that Polycom gives you. And then the last option we'll go is with solely using the XML-based configuration files. So what does it look like to configure a phone through the menus? Well, it's really easy to log into a phone. You basically just walk up to it, go into the menu structure, and you go into the advanced settings. In there, you'll see settings for network settings, DHCP, VLAN, things of that nature. Then there's the line settings, which are going to configure your line appearances, how the phone handles the different lines. Then the last option that you would configure are the call server settings. So SIP registration, or if you are using H323. Configuring those settings through the menu structure is very limited. You only have what they expose to you through the menu, so you can't configure anything custom. It all has to be done using the menu structure. It's also very difficult to configure because you're using a numeric-based keypad to type in usernames and passwords and credentials, so it does get very challenging to do that. So in a large deployment, or even a small deployment, it's very difficult to use the phone menu to actually do the phone setup. If you were doing maybe one or two phones, it's not that big of a deal, but this is by far the least favorite of my options, and I would rarely do this and wouldn't really suggest it to anyone else, except for select items that you're trying to configure. For example, you could configure a VLAN or some simple network settings without too much trouble when going into the phone menus. In the next slide, we'll go through and show you what the phone menu structure looks like so you can access it for yourself. To navigate the menu structure and to configure your phone, go into the Home menu and then scroll with the navigation key to the Settings menu. Select it. Then you're presented with Basic, Advanced, Features, and Status. Select option 2 for Advanced, which will ask you for a password. The password is 456 for defaulted phones. Select Enter, and then you can enter into the administration settings. Here you'll see network settings, where we can configure the VLAN and other network items. Line configuration, where we can change the lines and configuration of the phone. And then call server configuration, where we can configure the SIP carrier or the other SIP providers that we're using on the phone. Also have the option to do a factory reset or change the administrative password on the phone. There's a number of other settings within here that you can read about in the manual. We can also reboot the phone right from the menu. And then if we back out to the basic menu, we have options to set date times, languages, change ring time, and various other options. We also can change the backlight lighting. We can change the ringtone and update configurations, restart the phone. So it does give us a large variety of options when going through the phone configuration. Now that you've seen how to do it through the menu structure, which I'm sure you're not going to go out and rush to do, I want to show you the easier way of doing this through the web admin interface. So to configure using the web admin, we're basically getting all the same options that were available through the menu structure, except we're using a web-based tool. So I can log in from my computer, I can use copy and paste. It does make it a bit easier. So the phone has a built-in web server. It's going to give me all those same settings that we talked about, the network settings, the line settings, and then your call server settings. It's still very limited when it comes to the settings, so we can only configure what they expose through the web interface. So if they don't have an option for it through the web admin, you're not going to be able to make that setting change. It's very easy to configure via the web page because you can copy and paste all the values, and it just makes it a whole lot easier. It's very hard to deploy a large number of phones this way because if you have to log into every single phone and type in all the credentials and all the information for each phone, it does get to be very time consuming. It isn't terrible if you're doing a handful of phones or maybe a dozen phones. It is relatively straightforward to do, so it could be done relatively quickly, but when you add more and more phones, it just makes it more challenging. So in this screenshot, we can see this is a VVX 500, and this is the web interface. This is what it looks like, which we'll go through in more detail in a future video. But from here, you can see we can configure time settings, the SIP server, and then some of the other call server settings that are available to us. Now, if we wanted to use the UI, the web-based admin, and an XML file, which would give us a little more power and control, there's a pretty good combination for doing that. What you do is you use the phone's built-in web server, you use the user interface, and you can actually export and import configurations. So you have access to all of the settings that the phone has to offer through the XML file, but it gives you the ease of uploading and downloading that file to the specific phone. The advanced functionality is not available using any other configuration method. You need to use an XML file to get access to all of those settings. We can build custom buttons through this, so you can have macros or specific soft keys that you build to do unique things. So it's very customizable this way. So it does give you the full feature set. It is a little bit challenging because of all the different parameters that are available. And what happens is it's very poorly documented from Polycom's side. So it does make it a little more difficult to go in and build these XML files. But this is by far the much better option of when you're trying to roll out offices with a large number of phones. Basically, what you'll do is you'll log in and have a XML file that you've created for each phone, and you log into the user interface and use the import configuration file tool that will upload that config file you created from an XML file that you can see in the background here, and it will load all those settings directly onto the phone. It makes it a lot easier to be able to do all of these updates and changes, and that way you can store the XML files. The XML configuration file provisioning is a little more of a challenge because it does involve some servers that you need to set up, but it does give you the ability to easily provision a lot of phones. What you'll do is create basically handcrafted XML files for each of the phones. These phones can have generic settings because they are broken out into different sections, and you can load them on a server. The server will then push those out to all the phones. Again, using the XML file, it gives you access to all the settings the phone has to offer. So it's a very flexible tool to be able to configure these Polycom phones. Obviously, the advanced functionality comes from this because we don't have any other way of accessing that through a user interface. The configuration files would typically get loaded using a TFTP server to auto-provision. But what you can do is use other types of servers. There is a list of different servers within the phone that allows you to provision them. This is a full feature set when you use the XML files, so you're going to get access to all the different settings. Again, this is challenging because there's so many different parameters and variables and settings in there that it does get a little overwhelming. And the documentation is a little lacking, but if you do want to do something specific, there are some Polycom forums that are very helpful for you to look at. There's frequently asked questions and a lot of details around the configurations and how to do them on that forum. But again, it's not very defined. You're not going to be able to just do exactly what you want to do very easily. And this is really by far the best option if you're rolling out to a very large office where you have hundreds of phones. This is really the only way to do it in an efficient format. So again, let's look at a example XML file here. In the other slide, we did see a little bit of one, but we're looking at the settings here, and you can see that it's all XML based, and this is just a sample dump from a file or from a phone. And you can see that we have different settings, such as device setting, provisioning, server name. Then we have different settings for power savings. We have our TCP IP settings, and you can see the NTP server has been configured in there. So we have access to a lot of this stuff, and you just need to know which setting we're configuring, what parameters or values you can pass it, and how it all works. Then the phone will light up and run exactly the way you want it to. A lot of these settings you can just Google and be able to get how to configure them properly. The last thing we're going to cover here is the auto phone provisioning. So in the case of having XML files loaded onto a TFTP server that we want to auto provision to phones, how does that really work? Well, let's look at that in detail. So here we have a fictitious network where we have an IP phone, a DHCP server, and a TFTP server. This IP phone has its MAC address that we can see. We have the DHCP server, and in the DHCP server, we've defined a custom scope to provide an option 66. And option 66, the variable or the value for that is going to be the IP address of the TFTP server. So what happens is the IP phone is going to get plugged in to the network, and it will request an IP address from the DHCP server. When it does that, the DHCP server is going to reply with an IP address, and it's going to say within that IP address that it assigns it, this option 66 has been defined. That means you should go and talk to this server over at 192.168.1.5. So the phone says, okay. It then contacts this TFTP server saying, this is my MAC address. Do you have anything for me related to my MAC address? And the TFTP server will look through in its directory for the file or anything related to that MAC address. And all of these configurations are done via the MAC address itself. So that's how everything gets provisioned. The TFTP server then looks through and it finds that configuration file that exists for that specific MAC address. So it then sends the phone, yeah, I do have a file for you. Here, let me help you download that. And so the phone will actually start downloading that config file, and load it onto itself. And once it's done that, it will download that config file. Sometimes it may need to do a full reboot after that. And once it comes back up, all those XML values and settings that were configured will be loaded onto the phone, and it should register and be ready to go. So that's kind of a quick basic overview of how that auto provisioning takes place. So we'll go on to the next session.